so excited I could leave a spot right here on the carpet.
Now we are so happy we do the dance of joy.
Evie, are you all right? Evie, what's the matter?
Do you still cringe when you think about those awkward, overhyped sitcoms the 80s could not stop pushing? For every classic, these sitcoms were the shows we sat through anyway, hoping they would get better, even when we knew they would not. But why do we still remember the ones we hated? You watched it. You might not admit it, but you watched it. Small Wonder was one of those shows that crawled into syndication and refused to leave. Part sitcom, part fever dream, and fully impossible to explain. The premise? A robotics engineer builds a lifelike child robot and brings her home to pass her off as a daughter. And somehow, that was supposed to be the start of a heartwarming family comedy. The robot's name was Vicky. She spoke in a monotone. She wore the same red dress in every episode. She had superhuman strength, which she mostly used to stack dishes or accidentally launch her brother across the room. And that was it. That was the show. She vacuumed without blinking. She did homework like a calculator with bangs. She stared straight ahead while other characters laughed, cried, or wrestled with parenting dilemmas. She was basically a walking sci-fi punchline, but no one seemed to notice. Her creators programmed her to be obedient, quiet, and helpful, which probably says more about the 1980s than anyone wants to admit. The show hinted at deeper themes: identity, humanity, childhood, but never actually explored them. Instead, it just repeated itself like a looped cassette tape. Even the brother, Jamie, started to look like he had given up hope that anything new would happen. Entire seasons felt like reruns of themselves. You could tune in halfway through a random episode and not miss a thing. There was something hypnotic about it. Not good, but impossible to look away from. Vicky blinked once every 5 minutes. The parents acted like android adoption was a minor hiccup, and the audience just rolled with it. Watching Small Wonder felt like watching a VHS tape of someone else's dream. You did not enjoy it, but you kept pressing play. Every line landed like it had been delivered by a fax machine. Every episode followed the same robot learns feelings blueprint. It was like if HAL 9000 got cast in a family-friendly PSA. Vicky's robotic delivery might have made sense in-universe, but it did not make for good television. It made every scene feel like a table read for a joke that never came. But Small Wonder somehow lasted 4 seasons. It was cheap to make. It had a weird kid appeal, and it aired in syndication, which meant it could sneak into your after-school routine without warning. For a while, that was enough. And then, the novelty wore off. The show never evolved. The acting was wooden. The writing felt like it was churned out by a malfunctioning typewriter. The family was bland. The neighbors were worse. And Vicky, bless her digital heart, never stopped sounding like she was reading off a court transcript. Critics hated it. Viewers mocked it. And yet, Small Wonder became a kind of cult punchline. One of those shows that somehow burned itself into memory simply by being too weird to forget. Like the laugh track was daring you to take it seriously. And maybe that is why it stuck around. Because as terrible as it felt like nothing else. Offbeat, off-key, and off-limits to logic. The 1980s had a lot of bad sitcoms, but Small Wonder made you wonder something else entirely. How did anyone think this was a good idea? And then there was Mr. Smith, a sitcom about a talking orangutan who worked in the White House. That is not a joke. That was the plot. NBC, fresh off the success of smarter, sharper shows, gave us a monkey with a briefcase and expected us to laugh. Mr. Smith was supposed to be a political satire. The idea was that this hyper-intelligent ape, thanks to a government experiment gone right, becomes a Washington consultant and outsmarts every human in the room. And somehow that was supposed to be funny. Instead, it was just bizarre. The orangutan wore suits, gave speeches, and typed on a computer with his little monkey hands. Every scene felt like a sketch that had gone on too long. You kept waiting for someone to yell, "Cut!" and admit the whole thing was a prank. But they never did. There were actual episodes where he debated political policy. There were scenes of him giving press conferences to applauding humans. He had a handler, but even that character seemed confused half the time. One episode featured him outwitting Congress. Another had him writing a best-selling memoir. The show had zero interest in subtlety. Every joke came with a banana peel. There were attempts at romance, believe it or not. Romance with an orangutan in a tie. Even the studio audience sounded like it had been paid in confusion. You could practically feel the writers backing away from the typewriter in real time. And somehow, they still aired it. There was a gravity to how seriously it took itself, which made it even worse. The show wanted to be clever, West Wing by way of the zoo, but all we got was a monkey in suspenders quoting Benjamin Franklin. And somehow, the studio audience still clapped. It felt like television had officially given up. The humans around him were even more baffling. They all acted like it was completely normal to be taking policy advice from a primate. The jokes were limp. The premise collapsed under its own absurdity, and even the laugh track seemed hesitant. Mr. Smith barely lasted a season. It was canceled after just a few episodes, but not before making everyone who watched it question their sanity. It became the kind of show people brought up in hushed tones, like a sitcom ghost story. And yet the weirdest part? It was not a spoof. It was sincere. The network backed it. The writers tried. The actors did their best to sell punchlines written for a monkey in a suit. And somehow, none of them stopped to ask if this was what television was supposed to be. Looking back, Mr. Smith feels like a relic from a parallel universe, one where sitcoms stopped trying to be clever and started throwing darts at dartboards made of chimpanzee headshots. It did not just fail, it baffled. But if the 1980s taught us anything, it is that failure does not always mean forgotten. Mr. Smith remains a symbol of how wrong you can go when you start with a concept and never ask, should we? Sometimes a bad idea is just bad timing. And sometimes it is Jennifer Slept Here, a sitcom about a teenage boy haunted by the ghost of a 1950s movie star who used to live in his house. That is not a metaphor. She was literally dead. And yes, only the boy could see her. The parents? Clueless. The tone? Confused. The jokes? Mostly about how awkward it was to have a ghost hanging around your bedroom. Jennifer was played by Ann Gillian, who was great, funny, glamorous, and doing her best to hold the whole thing together. But the show was built on a premise that already felt dated the second it aired. Ghosts were not exactly a hot topic in sitcoms, and this one had all the problems of a haunted house comedy, without the scares or the laughs. Sometimes she appeared through mirrors. Sometimes she floated in from the ceiling. And every time she did, you could tell the special effects budget was maxed out. The show tried to balance slapstick with sincerity and missed both by a ghostly mile. It was not scary enough for kids and not sharp enough for adults. It lived in a weird in-between place where the biggest tension was, will Joey's mom walk in and catch him talking to thin air? Half the cast seemed like they were in a completely different show, and honestly, they probably should have been. One episode even ended with a musical number that felt like a rejected Disney Channel moment. By then, you were already asking yourself why you were still watching. Sometimes she walked through walls. Sometimes she vacuumed. There were no rules, just ghost gags. And the teenage lead spent half his time looking flustered while talking to thin air like he was stuck in a live-action cartoon. Even the theme song felt like it was winking at you while slowly backing away. Every episode followed the same beat. Joey gets into trouble, Jennifer tries to help, hijinks ensue, and nobody else sees a thing. The parents think Joey is weird. Joey thinks Jennifer is great. And Jennifer floats through walls in a ball gown, dropping one-liners like she is auditioning for I Dream of Jeannie fan fiction. There was no real logic to the show's universe. Sometimes Jennifer could touch things. Sometimes she could not. Sometimes she was invisible. Sometimes she showed up in a cheerleader outfit for no reason. It was sitcom magic without the charm or the consistency. NBC slotted the show on Friday nights, probably hoping it would hit with the same crowd that made ALF and Webster work. But Jennifer Slept Here never found its rhythm. Critics panned it, viewers forgot it. And by the end of the season, it was quietly canceled and barely mentioned again. And yet, if you were a kid in 1983, there is a weird chance you remember it. Not because it was good, but because it was strange. A ghost show that wanted to be a family comedy. A teen show that never got its tone right. It felt like a bunch of scripts from other shows got stapled together and sprinkled with glitter. No one really knew what kind of show Jennifer Slept Here wanted to be, including the show itself. Sometimes sitcoms age poorly. This one was born that way. If you ever wondered what would happen if Snow White and Prince Charming moved to a suburban cul-de-sac in 1980s America, someone at ABC beat you to it. The Charmings was a sitcom with one joke and no shame about running it into the ground. A fairy tale couple gets magically transported to modern-day Los Angeles and has to adjust to life with neighbors, minivans, and microwaves. It sounds like the setup for a sketch. But they tried to make it a weekly show, and for a moment they almost pulled it off. The cast was earnest, the costumes were kitschy, the sets looked like leftover props from a Disney on Ice rehearsal. And the laugh track? It was working overtime, trying to convince you this was all fine. They had Snow White baking enough pies to feed an entire kingdom. Prince Charming wore tights to work, and nobody batted an eye. The stepmothers schemed with a crystal ball in the laundry room. One of the kids had a crush on a classmate and asked for dating advice from a mirror. There was even an episode where a dwarf called in sick to school pickup duty. It was sitcom logic taken to its most literal and most baffling extreme. You watched it and wondered, is this genius or madness? The show never answered that question, but it did give you a talking mirror with better punchlines than most of the human cast. And honestly, that mirror deserved its own spin-off. You had a witch grandma who conjured spells over cereal, a magic mirror that sassed like a sitcom sidekick, and Prince Charming mowing the lawn like he was defending a castle. It was camp turned up to 11, and still somehow too tame. The show wanted to be clever, but ended up being pure Saturday morning cartoon logic at prime time. The stepmother had a magic mirror. The dwarves called on the phone. There was a sarcastic mirror who gave commentary like he was auditioning for a stand-up special. The whole thing played like Bewitched with a head injury. You could not tell if the writers were in on the joke or if the show just did not know how weird it really was. The problem was not the premise, it was the execution. Every episode was basically, Charming tries to use old-fashioned logic in modern times. Chaos follows. Lesson learned. Snow White bakes too much. Prince Charming mows the lawn in tights. The kids go to school and try to act normal. And the stepmother just plots and rolls her eyes. There was potential for satire, but the show never found a real voice. It wanted to be clever, but it was not. It wanted to be heartfelt, but it felt fake. It wanted to be relevant, but who in 1987 was asking for fairy tale characters to solve HOA disputes? The Charmings had a mid-season premiere, decent promotion, and a little buzz. But the ratings never showed up. It was canceled after one season, and has since lived on only in bootleg VHS clips and deep-cut sitcom trivia forums. But here is the thing. Some people still remember it. Maybe because it was so weird. Maybe because it tried something different. Or maybe because in a sea of workplace comedies and domestic chaos, it stood out. If only as a glittery, sword-wielding reminder that not every experiment needs to succeed. The Charmings was not a happy ending, but it sure was a strange beginning. If someone said we got it made today, you would think they were joking. Back in 1983, NBC said it like a promise and delivered a sitcom that aged faster than a carton of milk left in the sun. The premise? Two single guys in New York City hire a beautiful live-in maid. That is it. That is the show. And from the very first episode, you knew exactly where it was going. Nowhere new. It tried to be a buddy comedy. It tried to be a workplace comedy. It tried to be a sexy comedy without ever actually being sexy or funny. The maid, played by Terry Copley, was named Mickey, blonde, sweet, and constantly the target of dumb jokes about how hot she was. It was like watching someone try to remake Three's Company but forgetting to write the charm. The men, played by Tom Villard and Matt McCoy, acted like cartoon versions of bachelor roommates. Every conversation revolved around how clueless they were or how attractive Mickey looked in literally anything. Even the canned laughter seemed unsure of when to laugh. The show relied on sitcom tropes like they were fresh ideas: jealous boyfriends, bad cooking, awkward misunderstandings. Mickey did everything from fixing their plumbing to sorting out their dating lives, all while being ogled like a department store mannequin. The dynamic was off. The jokes were stale, and the vibe was pure, written in 30 minutes with a sandwich in one hand. Every gag was built around one of two things: Mickey looking great, or the guys being dumb about it. You could practically hear the pitch in the writer's room. Let's take two grown men and have them act like middle schoolers. Except middle schoolers would probably be less creepy. Critics pounced, viewers tuned out, and by the end of one season, We Got It Made was gone. But then, plot twist, it came back. Not because anyone demanded it, but because NBC launched a weird experiment called the NBC Saturday Morning Sitcom Block in 1987. Basically, reruns of sitcoms paired with a few new episodes to fill the air. So Mickey came back, the guys came back, the awkward flirting and who's doing the dishes hijinks came back, but no one really noticed or cared. It is one thing for a sitcom to fail. It is another thing entirely to fail twice. We Got It Made was never mean-spirited, just clueless. A relic of a time when the bar for sitcoms was low and the expectations even lower. And if you do remember it, you probably remember feeling uncomfortable without fully knowing why. It was not offensive. It was not outrageous. It was just lazy. Lazy writing. Lazy laughs. And a weird confidence that somehow this setup was enough. Spoiler, it was not. Out of This World was a show about a teenage girl with superpowers because her dad was an alien. She could freeze time by touching her fingers together. She talked to a glowing cube. Her mother was human. Her father spoke from the stars. And somehow, this was a comedy. The lead character, Evie, was played by Maureen Flanagan. And honestly, she did a great job with what she was given. The problem was everything around her. Because Out of This World was one of those shows that started with a wild idea and never quite figured out what to do with it. Episodes jumped from family sitcom lessons to time-stopping gags to deeply weird alien side plots. One week, Evie is helping a friend with a crush. The next, she is receiving space transmissions from a dad who sounds suspiciously like Burt Reynolds, because it was. You never knew if the show was going to tackle teenage angst or cosmic ethics. One minute, Evie is worried about a math test. The next, her dad is warning her about galactic threats through a glowing disco ball. Her powers were wildly inconsistent. Sometimes she froze time, sometimes she teleported, sometimes she just forgot she had powers. The cube spoke in riddles and fatherly advice, like a Siri that majored in psychology. The laugh track was aggressive, trying to convince you that watching Evie clean her room in fast forward was hilarious. The budget showed. The sets looked like leftovers from a daytime soap, and the visual effects were glorified screen wipes. The tone walked a tightrope between after-school special and low-budget Star Trek parody. The show leaned into its gimmicks, but the scripts were paper-thin, the special effects were bargain bin, and the tone all over the place. Sometimes heartfelt, sometimes ridiculous, sometimes just flat, and yet it ran for 4 seasons. Syndication gave it life. Kids watched it after school. Adults ignored it. Critics shrugged, and nobody really talked about it again. The weirdest part? Out of This World had all the ingredients of a cult classic, science fiction premise, teen drama. A strange, surreal tone that could have aged into something interesting. But it never did. It stayed stuck in that soft, safe, early 90s bubble. Too weird to be normal. Too normal to be weird. And then there was the cube, that glowing box where Evie talked to her dad. Floating in her room like a haunted disco ball. It was supposed to be comforting. It was mostly unsettling. Even for its time, the show felt like it belonged somewhere else. Some alternate dimension where sitcoms were written by a committee that had never met a teenager or an alien, but had strong opinions about both. When it ended, no one protested. No one begged for a reboot. No one put the cube on a t-shirt. Out of This World faded into the fog of shows you kind of remember, but only because the premise was bizarre. And if you do remember it, chances are you do not remember the jokes. You remember the fingers touching, the cube glowing, and the feeling that maybe, just maybe, you were watching something truly strange slip by on weekday afternoons. It was not out of this world. It was just out of place. If you blinked in 1984, you probably missed Mama Malone. And honestly, that might have been for the best. This was CBS trying to build an ethnic comedy around an Italian-American widow who hosted a home cooking show from her kitchen. Except the laughs were reheated and the recipes never quite landed. Lila Kay starred as Mama, a warm, no-nonsense woman with a rotating cast of family members, nosy neighbors, and nosier production crew all crammed into her Brooklyn home. And sure, it sounded like it had charm, if you only read the logline. What you got instead was a sitcom that felt like a leftover casserole of every tired cultural stereotype from the last 20 years. The accent was broad. The jokes were louder than they were funny. The family banter leaned hard into shouting, sighing, and "Mamma Mia" without a shred of freshness. And despite its title, very few people wanted to sit down and spend 30 minutes with Mama Malone. Each episode tried to cram in lessons about family and tradition, but they were buried under piles of pasta jokes and fake mustaches. The cast gave it their all, but no amount of good acting could save scripts that sounded like they were written on cocktail napkins. Every character felt like a caricature, right down to the hand-waving and food metaphors. It was like someone watched The Honeymooners and said, "What if we made it louder?" The kitchen setting was supposed to be cozy, but it felt claustrophobic, both literally and creatively. Even the laugh track seemed confused about when it was supposed to go off. Viewers did not relate. They recoiled. You could practically hear the remote controls clicking away. The show aired in early 1984 and was canceled almost instantly. Only a handful of episodes were broadcast, and most viewers barely remember it existed. Critics called it awkward and a throwback in the worst way. It felt less like a sitcom and more like watching a rejected pilot that somehow wandered onto your screen. CBS hoped it would be cozy, but what they delivered was a comedy with no timing, no spark, and a kitchen full of canned dialogue. It is the kind of show that makes you wonder how many people sat in meetings and said, "Yes, this is the one." And it is also the kind of show that proves warmth alone is not enough. You need structure, character, rhythm. Mama Malone had heart, maybe, but it needed a lot more seasoning. In the grand archive of forgotten 80s sitcoms, Mama Malone is not just forgettable. It is the kind of show you remember only because someone else brought it up, and then immediately wish they had not. If you ever wondered what happened when sitcom spin-offs go wrong, just say the words "The Ropers." This was what happened when television tried to bottle lightning a second time and dropped the jar. After Three's Company turned innuendo and miscommunication into a prime-time phenomenon, someone decided the next move was to give the nosy landlords their own show. Enter the Ropers, Stanley and Helen, bickering their way into suburbia. On paper, it made sense. Norman Fell and Audra Lindley had chemistry and a built-in fan base. But once you pulled them out of the chaos of Three's Company and dropped them into a more respectable neighborhood, the energy died. Suddenly, Stanley's grumpiness was not funny. It was just sour. Helen's flirtiness felt misplaced. And the jokes hit like leftover punchlines from a better show's cutting room floor. The dynamic that made them pop in short bursts just did not scale to full episodes. Scenes dragged. Situations were stale. Their new neighbors were dull as toast, offering none of the comedic spark that came from Jack, Janet, and Chrissy. You could tell the writers were scrambling to give Stanley and Helen something to do, anything to do, but they just circled the same tired gags about aging, marriage, and boredom. The show leaned too hard into repetition, like it was hoping that if you heard the same joke twice, it might finally land. Even the iconic theme song could not save it. You tuned in hoping for a spark. You got a sigh. ABC hoped the spin-off would bring over the audience from Three's Company. And at first, it kind of did. The premiere got solid numbers. But viewers quickly bailed once they realized the tension between the Ropers was not quite enough to carry 30 minutes of television. It was all squabbling and no setup. The neighbors were bland, the plot lines were recycled, the whole thing just felt off. Behind the scenes, things were worse. The actors had left their roles on Three's Company thinking the Ropers would run forever, but the show only lasted one full season before ABC pulled the plug, and by the time that happened, their old roles were already recast. That meant no going back, no return to the show that made them stars. It was the rare sitcom that not only failed, it burned a bridge in the process. Today, The Ropers is a cautionary tale, proof that sometimes even fan favorites should stay supporting characters. Because once you give them center stage, all the charm and timing can vanish like a sitcom laugh track in an empty room. Supertrain was not just a television show. It was a network's moonshot that crashed spectacularly on arrival. NBC had dreams of creating the next big primetime sensation in 1979, something to rival The Love Boat. But instead of ships and romance, they doubled down on a nuclear-powered futuristic train the size of a cruise liner, with weekly guest stars, mismatched tone, and a price tag that spiraled out of control. It was part science fiction, part soap opera, part disaster movie, and it somehow managed to be none of those things in a way that made sense. At the time, it was the most expensive show ever made for television, and it looked like it. The sets were massive, the model train sequences were high-end for 1979, and the promos made it sound like the future had arrived on rails. But beneath all the glitz was a show that had no idea what it was doing. The tone shifted episode to episode, veering from romance to mystery to light comedy without warning. And the characters? Well, they mostly walked around looking confused, and who could blame them? Every episode felt like the pilot to a different show. One week, someone's getting engaged on the train. The next, there's a jewel thief, or a nuclear threat, or someone trapped in the steam room. It was like the writers threw darts at a wall covered in soap opera tropes and just went with it. The acting was stiff, like no one could believe what they were saying. Even the train conductor had the 1,000-yard stare of a man wondering why he left Broadway. And the disco car? A time capsule of every bad fashion decision made in 1979. Supertrain was set on a luxury train that traveled from New York to Los Angeles in just 36 hours. It had gyms, pools, nightclubs, and even a discotheque, which sounds great, until you remember that viewers were supposed to believe this was on rails. Suspension of disbelief? Derailed at the first stop. The problem was not just the cost or the premise, it was that nobody really cared about what happened on board. The guest stars were forgettable, the main cast lacked chemistry, and every plot felt like a recycled soap opera storyline given a locomotive paint job. Despite NBC throwing a massive marketing push behind it, the ratings were anemic. Worse still, the critics piled on immediately. They hated the wooden dialogue, the aimless stories, and the fact that the most interesting character was the train itself. One reviewer famously called it the Love Boat without love, humor, or a point. NBC tried to fix it. They retooled the format, recast some characters, shortened the episodes. But it was too late. The public had tuned out, and the network had spent a fortune on what became a legendary television disaster. Supertrain ran for just 9 episodes before being pulled off the air. 9, out of a planned season that NBC had already sunk millions into. The sets were dismantled, the models were mothballed, and network execs quietly swore never to gamble that big again. But in a weird way, Supertrain lived on. Not as a beloved cult hit, but as a cautionary tale. A reminder that money does not buy story. That spectacle needs substance. That sometimes the biggest train in television history ends up being the slowest moving wreck. Today, Supertrain is remembered more for its failure than its fiction. But if nothing else, it proved one thing. There's no track wide enough to carry a show with no direction. Even in the weirdest corners of television history, My Mother the Car stands out. A sitcom where a man's dead mother is reincarnated as a talking antique car? Yes, that happened. In 1965, NBC greenlit one of the strangest concepts ever broadcast, and then syndication gave it new life in the 1980s, where it quietly haunted the UHF channels of many a childhood. It starred Jerry Van Dyke, Dick Van Dyke's brother, as Dave Crabtree, a perfectly average suburban guy who buys a 1928 Porter and discovers, to his horror and ours, that the car speaks in his mother's voice and offers parental advice. From the dashboard, it was meant to be sweet, whimsical, a little offbeat. But it played more like a prolonged fever dream of someone who had just read too many Oedipal-themed Twilight Zone episodes. And the laugh track? It could only do so much to disguise the awkward silences where punchlines were supposed to land. The car would guilt him from the garage. It would scold him during traffic. It would hum lullabies through the radio. You never quite got used to it, and the show never explained how it worked. Was it supernatural? Was it science fiction? Did the DMV know about this? It raised 1,000 questions and answered none. And that somehow made it even weirder. What made it even stranger was how sincerely the show treated its premise. The mother, voiced by Ann Sothern, dispensed life lessons. The villains wanted to steal the car. The family just sort of went along with it. Nobody really questioned why Dave was talking to the grill of his car in the driveway. Critics hated it. Viewers were baffled, and Jerry Van Dyke later called turning down Gilligan's Island to do this show the worst mistake of my life. The show only lasted one season, just 30 episodes, but that was enough. Enough for it to become a punchline. Enough for it to be referenced in nearly every worst sitcoms of all time list. And enough for it to earn a bizarre second life in reruns, where kids growing up in the 1980s stumbled across it and thought, "Did I imagine that?" Because it did run again, in syndication blocks, in late-night airings, in bargain bin VHS collections. Not because it was good, but because it was cheap, and weird enough to stick in your memory. Over the years, My Mother the Car became a kind of cult artifact. People did not love it. They loved remembering that it existed. It became part of television's long-running dare. Remember when they made this? And somehow, that made it last longer than most forgettable shows. It is terrible. It is oddly charming. And it is proof that in the wild world of sitcoms, sometimes the strangest cars take the longest detours. You would not want to drive it. But admit it, you kind of want to see how far it gets.